Alright, so today is going to be part one of a repair on a Tektronix TDS-640 oscilloscope. You can see that this is a pretty big piece of equipment. I actually wasn't expecting it to be this big. I was kind of expecting something, a lot smaller than this. But that's no big deal. We're just going to have to kind of work around that. Now, those of you familiar with the TDS 500, 600, and I believe even the 700 series of Tektronix scopes probably already know what the problem is going to be with this. And it's that on the post test, or the post rather, which is actually the startup test that the computer automatically does inside of the scope whenever you power it up, is a failure in the acquisition board and the processor board. Now, the processor board, I believe, is going to be because the NVRAM chip, it has an internal little button cell battery in it that's dead. So that's a really common issue with these. And the other really common issue with the acquisition side of it is that there's some surface mount electrolytic caps that leak and tend to eat traces and vias and can be a real killer on your PCB. Hopefully this scope is not going to be that bad. I'm really hoping that we'll get in there and just have to do a massive cap change. There may be a few other parts that are affected. Hopefully those are to a minimum, and nothing that's proprietary. I'm hoping that anything that I have to replace, I'm really hoping I can just buy off the shelf. But today is going to be demolition day. We'll get it pulled apart, and we'll get the acquisition board pulled off. I am going to recap the entire scope, but I think that the acquisition board is going to be our main focus. Everything else normally won't have issues. Whenever we change that NVRAM chip, I will go through that. But for today, we're going to get the board pulled and hopefully start pulling some capacitors depending on how much time I have. If not, that'll be another day that we'll actually get everything pulled apart. Okay, so normally on these scopes, there would actually be a big rear cover that is going to kind of clamp down on here, and there's these 4 screws in the corners would actually hold that cover on, and that's what keeps the actual metal enclosure in place. For some odd reason, this scope doesn't have that, and what they did was just add a chinky little metal hook that just kind of holds it. I really don't like that. I'm going to have the guys in the shop make me some little brackets that will use the screws that they're supposed to use. It won't be a full coverage thing. I think I'll just do something kind of simple here. In fact, we may make a video of actually designing that. These screws here that it's actually using on the hook is supposed to hold in an option. I'm not sure which option it is, and I don't want to lie about it, so I'll try to look it up later and let y'all know. But what you want to do if you have your cover is just pull these 4 screws off in the corners. They are actually going to be a Torx T20. And then you want to very carefully just nudge the scope out. Alright, so this is the top of the scope. This is actually going to be the processor board. And this chip right here that says Dallas on it is going to be that processor chip, that NVRAM. That hopefully is the only thing that's giving us the processor error. But what we're after is actually on the bottom of the scope. So let me get my computer screen out the way. There we go. So we're going to flip our scope over. So this is our acquisition board here. As you can see, the 4 channels input into this board. And I'm going to try to get the macro lens on the camera in a little bit so we can really see the damage that's done to this board. But you might be able to tell all of these little silver caps, each one of those is one of those SMD caps, and each one is prone to failure. So the best thing to do if you have a scope like this is to just recap the entire thing. Now, we do have some other damage that I'm hoping is not going too deep into the board, but there are look like some little amplifiers and things like that we're going to probably go ahead and change out too, because they look like they got hot. So let's go ahead and remove the board. It looks like it's going to be pretty simple. If we just remove these inputs on the back, the inputs on the front, and then this cable here. I don't think that one's actually supposed to run that way. It goes under the board. This thing must have been broken into before. It just kind of looks like it just has that look to it. But we'll get it pulled apart, and when we reassemble it, we won't put that under there like that. Get all these connections off. There's some ribbon cables on this side here, and also a connector board, kind of like a header board, I guess, almost. And we should be able to pull all those off, and there's a few Torx screws, and the board should come right off. To disconnect these ribbon cables, all you have to do is just grab each end and give it a little bit of a persuasive pull. There we go. All of these input cables just pull right out, and a T15 Torx is going to pull the board off for you. There's 6 of those. Alright, so here's what I found to be the best method to remove these capacitors. We're going to put a little bit of flux, and I'm going to use the paste here for no particular reason other than it's right in front of me. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to start preheating the board, just kind of, making fairly large circles just around the general area of the capacitor. And I'm just going to kind of spiral into it. And I'm watching how my flux is melting, how everything is kind of heating up. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to one of the sides of the capacitor that has a solder pad on it. We can see here, this is a little solder pad, and then there's a matching one on the opposite side. And we're going to just bounce back and forth, just putting some heat on there. And it takes a good bit of time. I don't know if that's because of my heat gun or just because of the board or what. But it does take a lot of time to really get that capacitor to come loose. So you just want to kind of keep working from side to side. And you want to try to get the heat under it. If you can't really get close, if there's components or anything, not a big deal. Just try to keep bouncing back and forth and heating up both of those pads. I'm applying just a little bit, not a whole lot of upward pressure, just to kind of give me a sense of whenever my solder is going to start melting. But I'm not pulling so hard that whenever it does start melting on one side, it'll actually rip the pad off the other side. Just a really light, gentle little touch here. And there you go. It's not too bad. It's a little time consuming, but I also tried the dual soldering iron, and it's just I think that this solder is just really hard to work, and I found that the heat gun is the best way to do it. Okay, so we're about to start wicking the board. I'm going to use this super wick from MG Chemicals. It has a no clean flux inside of it. I highly recommend that you get some kind of wick with a flux in it. This stuff works really well it really helps to reflow that solder. Right here you can see that I'm using a dab method to try to wick the pads off of that IC component placement. And the dab method just doesn't work well for me in most cases. You can see that I'm actually sticking to a pad there, and I'm actually using the chisel tip on the Heiko. It's pretty easy to remove, but later on I go to the kind of mop method, and I find that that works much better. It helps. It's a lot smoother motion, and it's quicker and easier, I find. Also note that I'm not applying any pressure actually whenever I'm putting the tip of the soldering iron on the wick. You just want just enough for that heat to flow through, because it's got to heat that wick up, and it's going to heat up that solder and melt it, and then you can just kind of drag along. That's why I call it the mop method, because you're just kind of mopping that solder right on up. And I found that that was the best method to do this, and it just works really well. Alright, here I'm just cleaning up with some isopropyl alcohol and a little stiff brush. And that's just to kind of clean up all the garbage that's just left behind on the board from desoldering and old flux, and just to kind of get me down to the newest surface that I can have. And it works really well. I'm running into a little bit of an issue here on actually wicking the pads for these capacitors. You could see a lot of this corrosion is actually not really coming off. You can't wick the corrosion away. The copper just won't suck it up. So I'm having to do something a little bit different for these pads. This one's actually scraping away pretty well, but I don't want to have to scrape every single pad. So what I've come up with is actually, if we look at this one here, I haven't done anything with this one yet other than put a little bit of flux on there. Let's see if we can do this without shaking things up too bad. I've got my chisel tip back on my iron. We're going to come in and we're going to heat it up, and I'm just going to kind of, not really applying pressure, but still kind of do a little scraping motion along that solder. And that flux is going to help prevent any oxidation from sticking back to it. And that, you can tell that kind of just moves it around. Then after that, we'll do a little bit of alcohol.
Quentin, to line 1, please. Quentin, line 1.
And brush. It takes a little bit of effort with the brush, but you can get it mostly clean. Now that looks really good. I'm still gonna actually come back and wick that because there is still some solder on the pad, and I noticed that this solder doesn't seem to, it just doesn't work really well for me. So I do want to get rid of that solder and apply fresh solder whenever I go to replace that component. So I've just got through installing a jumper wire and a little via repair here. I didn't really need the jumper wire so much as it was just the simplest way to repair that via right here. So I'll try to show you all that in a little bit. I believe that I do have a couple more on the board that I can that I might have to fix, but for now I just want to show you, if you look at this little IC here, I'm not exactly sure what this is, but you can see kind of the corrosion on the leads and stuff. And I don't think that I'm going to replace this IC, but I will address the corrosion on the leads. So this is just going to be to show you how I do that. I think that it's a pretty good method. It's pretty simple, it's pretty effective. So let's get started. I will be showing this under the microscope, so I apologize if it's not the best footage, but I think that you'll be able to get the effect a lot more through the microscope than if I just use the camera. Okay, so as you can see, we have this little IC here. We've got some corrosion on these pads. This one is not really horrible bad. There were some worse ones on here, but I kind of use those to more or less just perfect my method. But you can see we do have this leg is decently corroded. We can see some green here. This side is really not too bad at all, other than this leg. But I think that it'll be bad enough for us to kind of just go through how we're gonna, I hate to say save these, because I really don't think we're saving it. We're just dressing them up. First of all, let's start off with some flux. So my soldering iron is set to about 600. This is the Hakko 888 if you're curious. And for my tip, I'm going to be using this bent tip here. If you're wondering where to get one of these bent tips in a T18 for the 888 Hakkos, I don't think that they make them. But if you buy a really fine little conical tip, you can bend it very carefully, and it works pretty good for SMD type stuff like this. Now, we're going to just kind of heat those legs up, and we're going to come in and we're going to start adding some solder. We're going to add a lot more solder than you think you need. And this is why it's really important to have flux on, because we're going to burn the flux off of the solder. And we're going to burn through a lot of the flux that's actually applied to the IC itself. But that's good, because what the solder is doing is actually cleaning as we're burning. Sorry about that. And then we'll switch to the other side, and we'll just keep on kind of running through that. What we're looking for is for solder to actually start sticking to the leads themselves. So we want to apply heat just like you would if you were resoldering. But we're just kind of basically scrubbing it with liquid solder almost. As you can see, that one doesn't look like it actually made any bridges. So let's go ahead and clean our tip up really good. And then we'll come back and just kind of repeat that process again, just on a more individual basis on each lead. If you find you're having trouble with the solder sticking to the leads and making a bunch of bridges, just keep cleaning your tip and coming back and basically wicking away with the tip itself a little bit at a time. Okay, I think that might be good enough. So what we'll do is spray some alcohol. We're going to put a good bit because we want to have a lot of liquid there for that flux that we didn't use to kind of dissolve into it. And then we're just going to start scrubbing. I like to go perpendicular to the leads at first, and then I'll come in and go parallel with them. And you really want to make sure you catch the ends of the IC, because what you're actually doing whenever you do that is kind of pushing a little bit of that alcohol underneath the IC itself and helping just to flush out any extra solder. And then we'll spray some more alcohol. I don't know what I did without this spray alcohol. This stuff is awesome. I'll tell you what. A little bit of keyboard cleaner, just to kind of dry the area off a little bit. And then a little bit of alcohol and a Q-tip. Some people don't like using Q-tips for this because it can leave filaments on the IC. If you're doing this under a microscope already and you see any filaments, just grab it with your tweezers. Okay, so that looks much improved. But I think that this lead right here the solder joint looks a little wonky to me. So we'll apply a little bit of flux with a pin. The reason I'm going to use a pin this time is because the pin flux is a little bit thinner, so it'll be a little bit easier for us to clean up. Come on, you, what is the problem here? I think that the alcohol is leaching a lot of heat off and making it hard to rework that solder. Looks like a very slight improvement. The solder looks a little heavy right here. Clean that up. Okay, I like that. I think that that will be good. Okay, so I'll repeat that process for any other oxidation that I see that I just want to kind of rework the leads and not actually replace the IC. And I'll look for some more vias and see if we can get that on film. Alright guys, well, I've got the board all wicked off. I've got it cleaned up really well. I'm probably still going to do a few more rounds of cleaning on it just kind of as we go. At this point, I believe that I'm just waiting on components. I do think that I have a few vias that I have to address to just kind of fix, maybe put some really short little jumper wires in there. But I'll do that as I'm putting components on and find them a little bit easier. You know, right now the board is just kind of a massive thing to take in as a whole. So when I'm going component by component and I'm inspecting everything, you know, one little bit at a time, it'll make it a lot easier for me to say, yep, there's a bad via. You know, let's go ahead and get that repaired, put that component on, and then move on as we go. I think that'll just help me simplify things a little bit. So that will be in part 2. Before I stop this video, I have to give a big thanks to MG Chemicals. They were nice enough to send me a whole bunch of really fantastic consumables. In fact, I believe all the consumables I used in this video were from them. That spray alcohol, I don't know how I lived without that. The cleaning brush, solder paste, flux, just all kinds of stuff, and it's been really great. So big thanks to them, and stick around for part 2 and we'll get some components soldered onto this thing. Thanks for watching.